Gotta talk about bread, don't we? Hi everyone, my name's Jake. Welcome to the Kitchen Scrap, where I'm currently challenging myself to learn to survive on British WW2 rations for an entire year.
That sounds most unsuitable.
So as I mentioned in my previous video, while bread wasn't actually rationed during the war, it was heavily regulated. Now, if you haven't seen my previous video, which was an introduction to my year of rationing, I'll wait. Now, around the time when war was announced, Britain was importing 70% of its grain to make flour and other foodstuffs. Now, given the logistical dangers of these imports once the war commenced, naturally they were heavily reduced. So the government had to try their best to make do with what limited imports they could get and what they could grow at home. So these days, while I would say a majority of people tend to lean more towards a somewhat healthier wholemeal loaf, back then, sliced white bread was just the thing. At least that was the case until the 6th of April in 1942, when a complete and total ban on pure white commercial bread products came into effect. You see, the production of white flour was considered quite wasteful, not just in terms of nutrients, but in terms of time and energy as well. So when they mill the grain, all that bran is sifted out, which is where a lot of the nutrients come from. So from that point on, it was illegal to produce and sell white bread. So this is when the wholemeal National Loaf was introduced to the public, and everyone hated it. Now, by law, the bread had to be sold unwrapped, unsliced, and the day after it was baked. The theory was by then it would have gotten a little bit stale, so it was easier to cut smaller slices and eat less of it. The government was really pushing for people to not only accept this new national loaf, but to eat less bread in general. Even the official legal size of a loaf of bread was reduced from 16 ounces to 14 ounces. Now, by 1943, there were a few variations. They were allowed to substitute 10% of the wholemeal flour with that of potato, oat, or barley flour. Now, apparently there were only 4 official recipes for the national loaf, and I think I may have found one. I'll pop it up here. Now, if you are interested in making this, keep in mind it yields 10 loaves, so if you just want to try it out and make one, just divide all the ingredients by 10. Now, there were actually a lot of reports that this bread appeared grey and mushy, and I have a theory about this because they used to add calcium and other vitamins. Now, as you can see in this recipe, they do use some potato flour. I did think about purchasing some, but it costs about $5 or $6 for about 500 grams, when for the same price, I could get 4 kilos of wholemeal flour. I just can't justify the cost of it, so I'm not gonna worry about it. Aside from the common complaint that it was already dry and stale by the time they actually had a chance to purchase it, a lot of people did actually mention it was grey and unappealing, and it had a texture which was coarse like sawdust, and a crust that was as hard as wood.
That does sound good.
Now, it's worth noting at this point that in some parts of occupied Europe, some people actually did used to put sawdust in their bread as essentially a gap filler. Not only that, they also used to include something called silage. Now, silage is basically when a farmer will clear their field of the grass and the clover and whatnot. They'll put it into a silo. They don't dry it out first. The point is to keep it wet and moist. They will keep on adding to it, and then come the winter months, that's what they'll use to feed their livestock. People were putting this in their bread. So you know what? Give me some old, stale grey British National Loaf any day. So in this video, we're going to be testing out 3 traditional wartime recipes, and whichever one works out the best is the one that I'm going to be making for the rest of the year. The blog that I'm referencing for the first recipe is from the wartimekitchen.com. Don't know if it's an official National Loaf recipe, but it's definitely a traditional wartime recipe. So let's see how we get on. Okay, so for this recipe, you will need 1.5 pounds of bread flour. I'm just using wholemeal, of course. 1.5 tablespoons of salt, which that's a lot, but that's what they did back then because salt acts as a preservative. So the bread was considered to be quite salty. This one is calling for a dessert spoon of honey or treacle, and I figured this was a good time to try and use up some of this golden syrup that has been sitting in my cupboard forever. In terms of the yeast, I'm just using this instant dry yeast. I know this is not the kind that they would have had back then. I don't even know if you can get what was available back then. Anyways, this is what we've got. This is what we're using. So we're just going to use 1 sachet of that. Also, little note, keep your yeast in the freezer. It will last forever. Oh, sorry, I forgot. About 2 cups of tepid water. So this is just lukewarm. You don't want it too hot because that'll kill the yeast. Basically, the way I've always done it, mix the yeast in the water with whatever kind of sugar that you're using first. But this just says to mix it all together. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to whack in the yeast, chuck it in, give that a stir. Now I'll add the salt. You don't want to add the salt at the same time as the yeast because apparently the salt can kill it. Let's give that a bit of a stir. So I have just dissolved 1 dessert spoon of golden syrup into 2 cups of water, and I'm just going to pour this in. Don't forget to spill it all over your countertop. Those are the rules. We're just going to give this a good old mixeroo just to get it going. Oh, that is thick. And then once it gets to the stage where you actually just cannot stir it anymore, just get in there with your hands. It's part of the fun. And I'm just going to start kneading this, bring it all together. This feels quite moist for a bread dough. Maybe that about 2 cups thing was just a suggestion. I actually think I'm going to have to add more flour to this. We'll see how we go. I should have started slower. Super moist. Oh my God. Okay, it's not too bad. Oh God, it just feels very sticky. Wetter than I'm used to. But you know what? Depending on the climate that you live in will actually have an impact on bread making and pastries and things like that. Like if it's quite humid like today, I'm probably gonna have to add a bit more flour. All right, now I normally don't have to flour my surface, but I have a feeling that today I will have to. Make sure we get everything. All right, I need to set a timer. We have to knead this for 10 minutes. Now, if you have a KitchenAid with a dough hook, just whack it in there and let it go. I don't have one, so we're going to do this the traditional way, 10 minutes, and we're just going to knead away. I'm definitely gonna have to flour this surface today. Never had to do that when I'm making bread before. Is it me or is it the recipe?
It's you!
Far out. Okay, hold on. Need to get some more flour. That's much better. So just start kneading this for 10 minutes. Kneading bread isn't my favorite thing to do. It's a bit of a drag sometimes, but it can be a good workout. You might be tempted to just go for 7 or 8 minutes, but really do push for the 10 because in those final 2 minutes, you will actually feel the dough just becomes really soft and smooth and elastic. There's a subtle change that happens in those final few minutes of kneading. So away we go. Alright, so we have just finished kneading it for 10 full minutes. Here I was bragging that I've never had to dust my surfaces before, and honestly I never have when I've made bread before, and it's been fine. But this one was really wet and sticky. I had to dust it 3 times. I think it was a combination of factors. I did use the full 2 cups of water. Also, the golden syrup made it extra sticky, and it's also really humid as well. Anyways, we've got a clean bowl. We're just gonna whack this in. Now, ordinarily, you should probably run some olive oil over this and over the dough as well to prevent it from drying out. However, I cannot spare the fat, so we're just going to leave it in the bowl. Next, you're just going to grab a clean towel, cover it, and leave it somewhere warm. So the recipe does say to let this rest for 2 hours. Once that 2 hours is up, we then have to bash it down a little bit, knead it out a little bit more, and let it do its second rise, which we'll do in the tins. But the recipe does say to do the second rise for another 2 hours, which I kind of think is a little bit extreme and we risk overproofing. So I'm just gonna gauge it. During the second rise, once it gets big enough, I'll just whack it in the oven. Okay, so the bread dough has risen quite nicely. Now all I'm going to do is take it out of the bowl, just let it plop down. Make sure you get everything from the bowl. And then I'm just going to knead it out a little bit more, not too much. It is kind of a bit dry on the top because I didn't use oil. I'm just going to divide it into 2 even loaves, roughly. Give them a bit of a shape up. All right, so I've got 2 tins. I'm not even gonna grease or oil these. I'm just gonna chuck them in. And probably just going to let them rise until they double in size, however long that takes. I'm gonna cover these back up. We will whack them in the oven. All right, so the bread has been rising for a second time for an hour, and guess what? They've overproofed. I thought they would. The recipe said to let them rise for a second time for 2 hours. They have deflated considerably. It's okay though, we're just gonna whack these in the oven, bake them for 30 minutes. I'm just going to have really dense National Loaf bread. And you know what? I would have been lucky to have it back then. So food is food. So the bread's done. Let's be honest, it wasn't a win in the kitchen today. It's really flat. The second rise, it overproofed. What can you do? These things happen. It's still perfectly edible. I'll freeze this one and I'll just work my way through this one over the next few days. It's really salty. Oh my God. But I did try some with a little bit of margarine and some of this spiced apple jam that my mum made me. It tasted just like a hot jam donut and I'm fine with that. It was absolutely beautiful. So bit of a disaster, but I think it's safe to say next week I'll be trying a different National Loaf recipe. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new wartime bread recipe. Confession, I have already demolished that bread that we made the other day, which is very naughty. To be fair, they were quite small, those two loaves, so if you put them together, that would kind of constitute a regular sized loaf of bread. That's what I'm telling myself anyway. I've had a very busy week, and so I've definitely been reaching for the convenience items, which I have none of because when you're doing this diet, you have to make everything from scratch. But there have been a lot of salad and raw vegetable sandwiches, which were really delicious. And I've been eating a lot of bread with my carrot and oatmeal soup. But that changes today. I'm going to be making a lovely hearty meal for myself this evening, but we do need more bread. So today's recipe comes from this book here, Food Facts for the Kitchen Front. It's one of my favorites. It's just a recipe for brown bread. I do believe this book was published in 1941. It came out before the National Loaf was a thing because it actually calls for 14 ounces of wheatmeal flour and 14 ounces of white flour, which we're not going to be using. We're just going to go 100% wholemeal. Now I'm just using this recipe as a guide. I'm going to do it my way this time. We'll have all the same measurements, but I'm going to trust my intuition. So let's get cooking. So I've already measured out 28 ounces of flour, which comes to approximately 800 grams. And in this, I've added 1.5 teaspoons of salt. This recipe calls for 3/4 of a pint of tepid water, which I've measured out here. It's about 426 mils, to which I am going to add with my Ration sugar here, 1/2 teaspoon. That's what the recipe calls for. Now that seems more like a wartime recipe to me. So about that much. It's going to dissolve that. Now the recipe says to cream the sugar and the yeast together before you put it in the water. But again, I think they were using a special kind of baker's yeast back then, whereas I'm just using a packet of the old instant stuff. So all I'm going to do is put the yeast in the water to activate it, and it's going to start feeding on that sugar. I'm not even going to stir it. I'm just going to leave it here for about 5 minutes. Eventually, it'll just start to bubble and froth, and that's when it's ready. I can already smell it. So we'll be back in a second. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes. Basically, all that happens is that the yeast will sink to the bottom, and then after a few minutes, it will activate and it will just froth up to the top again. So I don't know if you can see that. So we are just going to add this to the flour and the salt. Now that water was only lukewarm. Give it a bit of a mix. Oh, this is going to be a very dry dough. Time to get my hands into it. I may even have to add a little bit more water. It's very dry. So the other one was quite wet. This is very dry. Oh, she's tough. Okay, I'm just going to add a touch more water to this, not too much. Oh, right, this one's going to be a workout, I can tell. There's still all of that left in the bowl. So now, I should have done a time check. We want to knead this for, again, 10 minutes. This will be okay. It's coming together. I can feel it. Just get the rest of that out. Don't waste anything. All right, so I have been kneading this for 10 minutes and wow, this was a tough mother. I actually broke a sweat with this one. I also had to stop and wet my hands during just to help get the dough moving and make it a little bit more pliable, which seemed to have done the trick. And sometimes you'll find that you will need a little bit more water depending on the climate that you're in. It's nice and soft now. So we're just going to chuck it into a clean bowl, chuck it in. Now the recipe simply calls for it to double in size. There's no timing. Except for the second rise, it advises only 15 minutes, which seems more accurate to me. So we'll be back once this has doubled in size to split them up into loaves. Alright, so it's been just over an hour and this has puffed up nicely. So I'm just going to split this up into 2 loaves. Make sure you get it all out. Give it a little bit of a knead in the meantime. Oops, I dropped some. Oh well. Just separate them out as evenly as you can. They're about the same-ish. Alright, so I'm just going to whack them in the tins. I've got my oven preheating now, so it says to cook them in a hot oven for about 45 minutes. So I've got my oven on 200, which is fan force. So if it's not fan force, go 220. It's actually been about 20 minutes. I got sidetracked, but let's check these out. Okay, they puffed up relatively well. They're going to be very dense though, aren't they? I'm wondering, should I let them go a little bit longer? Maybe 10 minutes more? Let's do that. See if it makes a difference. Alright, I gave them another 10 minutes. I think that's just going to be it. They're quite small. That extra 10 minutes didn't seem to do anything. So we'll whack these in the oven, so 45 minutes at 200 degrees, fan forced. The bread's done. So we've ended up with 2 small loaves. I actually took these out at the 32-minute mark. When I checked on them, they were ready to come out. So at 200 degrees, fan forced, I would say 30 minutes is perfectly fine if you choose to make this recipe. I actually weighed these and they're each 1 pound 4 ounces. So how's that for an even split? Kudos me. I won't lie, that crust, you could knock someone out with one of these babies. It's gonna be a nice crust, and I know it'll be nice and soft in the middle, but yeah, we'll see what this one's like when I tuck into it at some stage. So there you have it, bread recipe number 2. Thanks to the marvelous wonders of the internet, we have now fast forwarded to almost the end of the 2nd week. And I have to say, this old rationing biz is going pretty well. I'm actually shocked at how much of my week 1 rations I had left over. I had tea left over. I can't believe it. I barely touched my sugar ration. That being said, I have been using the honey that I was gifted in my tea, so I imagine once that runs out, my sugar rations will deplete quite significantly. But especially the fats, didn't even touch my butter ration. I only made it through half of the vegetable shortening and the margarine as well. I think I might actually cut down on the fat rations because I just can't see myself getting through that much fat each week. I don't know, but pleasantly surprised. Also, something else that I've noticed is that my general waste has reduced quite significantly. I have a bin in my apartment, it's probably about that big, and I emptied it on New Year's Eve day. It's now Friday the 12th of January. The bin is only just now half full. I haven't had to take it out because I'm just using a lot less packaging. I'm hardly wasting anything at all, which is fantastic to see such significant results in such a short amount of time. I'm thrilled, frankly. So today's bread recipe actually comes from Carolyn's website, the 1940s Experiment. The reason I chose this one is because we're actually going to be using a little bit of fat for it, which I thought was nice, different, unusual. So for this recipe, you will need 600 mils of warm water, 5 teaspoons of quick dry yeast. I've just got, again, I'm just going to use one of those packets. 2 pounds of wholemeal flour, a couple of pinches of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, a tablespoon of rolled oats just for the top, and a spoonful of butter or margarine or just a drizzle of vegetable oil. Now, technically, recipes 2 and 3 aren't National Loaf recipes, but they are traditional wartime recipes. And I'm hoping that this one is the one. The first one, it was perfectly edible. It was quite salty, which I think, would have been the case back then. The second one, again, perfectly edible, but I needed a freaking hacksaw to cut that across. That was next level. So I'm excited to try this one. And if this ends up being the favorite, we're going to stick with this for the remainder of the year. So let's get cooking. Okay, so I've already got my 2 pounds of flour, a couple of pinches of sugar, and a little bit of salt in here. So I'm just going to add the yeast. Give that a stir to make sure it's evenly distributed. Then I'm going to add 600 mils of warm water. I've just melted about a spoonful of butter. So we're going to give this a good old stir. Start bringing that together with your hands. Once again, we are going to knead this for 10 minutes. Okay, wow, so based on that kneading experience alone, the recipe on Carolyn's website for the win. I thought it was going to be really wet and sticky, but it wasn't at all, and it was so soft and pliable. It was almost a joy to knead that for 10 minutes. So I'm really interested to see how this one turns out. Once again, we're just going to form it into a ball, whack it in, cover it up, put it some space warm. Just going to leave this until it doubles in size, maybe about an hour. We'll see how we go. Now, it's been about an hour and this has puffed up rather nicely. So I'm just preheating my oven. It says to cook it for about 30 or 40 minutes at 180 degrees or 160 if it's fan force. It also mentioned you should lightly flour your bread pans, which I never do, but I'm going to trust the recipe. So again, we're just going to divide this. So I'm going to pull it out. Oh, she's heavy. Whoa. Make sure we get it all out and divide it. You can feel this one's a little bit bigger. Doesn't matter. Cover them up again and let them rise for a second time, basically just until they have doubled in size. So it's been about 20 minutes and these are looking lovely. So the recipe then calls for a bit of water brushed on top, and then we're going to sprinkle some oatmeal or some oats on the top. It's really just for decoration. That'll do. All right, so I am just going to pop these in the oven, which is currently at 160 fan force or 180. If it's not, bake it for about 30-40 minutes. So the bread is now out of the oven. It's definitely a paler loaf, but I think this turned out pretty well and I'm looking forward to trying it. I did actually let it cook for 40 minutes. I checked on it at the 30-minute mark and it didn't quite seem like it was ready then. Overall, I think this was a success. So in conclusion, let's review the 3 recipes that we've tried out. Now regarding the first one, obviously there were a few issues with the person making it, but I do think that recipe is flawed. This has nothing to do with the blog that it came from. I just think that that second rise time of 2 hours is bonkers. Now, out of the 3, that one was definitely the saltiest, which I didn't actually mind so much because they were predominantly consumed with salad sandwiches and it had a little bit of sweet mustard pickle as well. So the saltiness actually really added to the flavor and it was perfectly enjoyable. Now it did start to dry out, I would say, on the second night. So if you do make 2, definitely freeze one of them. They all freeze beautifully. Would I make it again?
Absolutely not. I couldn't possibly.
The second loaf, again, it was perfectly edible. Nice flavor, nice texture, but as I mentioned earlier, that crust was something else. If you are going to make that one, I would actually recommend that you just cook it for 30 minutes at 180. That would do it perfectly. That one started to dry out on the 3rd day. Would I make that one again?
Yes.
I would actually like to revisit that recipe at some stage to make it the way the recipe suggested by using 14 ounces of white flour and 14 ounces of wholemeal. And last but certainly not least, we have the wartime bread recipe from Carolyn's website, the1940sexperiment.com. Would I make it again? Yes! Yes, I would. I was a little over-enthusiastic there. I'd stacked a tower of dishes in my sink because I was soaking them. That recipe was amazing. It's a really great flavor, a really great texture. It didn't actually start drying out until the 4th day, which was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed that one. That's definitely the one that we are going to be making for the rest of the year. In fact, my mother likes to make her own bread as well. And knowing that I was doing this video, she asked for a wartime bread recipe. So I gave her that one. She made it, and both her and my father really, really enjoyed it. So there you go. 3 people can confirm it's a solid winner. So there we have it. 3 traditional wartime recipes. Let me know if you end up making any of them. So thanks very much for watching, everyone. Lots of love and light to you all. And until next time, keep calm and eat less bread.